Hi, this is Dr. David Tranter. If you are like me, you start every school year with a renewed resolve to be an even better teacher, to make school better for everyone, students and educators alike. But how do we make effective change, especially given all the pressures in education? What should be our focus when there is so much to pay attention to? After all, change is not merely a matter of introducing a new initiative and seeing it spread. The paradox of education is that there is so much change and yet so little on a more fundamental level. To gain greater insight into the challenge of meaningful change in education, let's take a look at two recent research studies. Study number 1, Teaching Mindfulness to Students. The My Resilience in Adolescence program was developed by mental health experts, but was delivered by teachers. Teachers attended a 4-day training program in which they learned to practice mindfulness themselves, and then learned how to teach it to their students. In one of the largest social-emotional studies ever done, researchers took over 8,000 students, ages 11 to 12, and randomly assigned half to receive the 10-week mindfulness training program in class, while the other half attended their classes as usual. The mindfulness teens received regular instruction in emotional regulation and mindfulness, and were encouraged to practice mindfulness throughout each day. So, what happened at the end of the 10 weeks? At the end of the course, the mindfulness teens showed worse scores on depression and well-being as compared to teens who received no mindfulness instruction. Most concerning, the teens who had been identified at the outset as already at the greatest risk for mental health difficulties responded the poorest to mindfulness instruction. They were the most likely to get worse rather than better. Study number 2, Restorative Practices. Researchers selected 14 middle schools, grades 6 to 8. 7 were randomly chosen to receive 2 years of restorative practices intervention, while the other schools received nothing, just business as usual. In the restorative schools, staff received 4 days of comprehensive restorative practices training. They had coaches that provided assistance in person and by phone. Staff also met regularly to talk about their work and to support each other. Over the 2 years, the staff supported students to resolve conflicts, use I statements, talk about their feelings, and participate in both proactive and responsive restorative conferences. Meanwhile, for the non-restorative schools, it was business as usual. So, what happened? After 2 years, when the intervention and business as usual schools were compared on measures such as school climate, connectedness, social skills, bully victimization, and more, no significant difference on any measure was shown. Implementing restorative practices appeared to make no positive impact. How can we make sense of these kinds of results, which, by the way, are not uncommon in education at all? Well, we need to look at the two very different types of thinking when it comes to the way we implement change in education. Overwhelmingly, the most common approach is where we simply ask, what's the problem that we're trying to address? Then, what outcome do we want? And then, what solutions are available to get us there? Then we deliver the solution and measure the outcome. This is called a linear approach. Linear approaches can work fairly well, but only for quite simple problems, where the problem and solutions are pretty clear. Something like solving the problem of getting kids to school each day. The problem? Students need transportation to school. The outcome? Every student needs to get to school safely and on time at a reasonable cost. The solution? Use buses and create efficient pickup routes to get all students to and from school each day. Problem solved. But for complex problems like supporting student mental health and education, or ensuring equity among all students, or reducing violence at schools, where there are many contributing factors and where both the nature of the problem and what the desired outcomes might be are unclear, we need to take a systems approach. A systems approach recognizes that the problem involves a lot of moving parts, and positive outcomes will require more than just layering on yet another strategy or program. Something much more fundamental needs to change. We use the term systemic change a lot, but what does this actually mean, and how does it differ from linear change? To understand systems thinking compared to linear thinking, let's step outside of education just for a minute. Let's say we are trying to change the game of basketball. Basketball is a system. It's composed of players, coaches, referees, perhaps an audience. We've got a court, a ball, baskets at both ends, and 5 players per side, everything interacting together all at once. A linear approach to change focuses on changing the elements of the system that we can readily see. This is the what of the system, the obvious, tangible parts. So, we might, for example, change the court size or shape. We could raise or lower the baskets. We could increase or decrease the ball size. We could add extra players. We could even change the players. Any of these would change the game a little, but changing the what doesn't really change the game very much. We'd still recognize it as basketball. Now, let's shift our focus from linear thinking to systems thinking. Systems thinking acknowledges the what of systems, but it focuses its efforts on the intangible parts, changing the how and the why of the system. Let's look at the consequences of altering the how of basketball, like how the players interact, the rules of the game, how information flows. Let's say the player must no longer bounce the ball, but now kick it instead. Now we have a soccer game. Or let's say the players all have to swim instead. It's water polo. How about allowing the players to simply hold the ball and run? It's football. Or let's change the information flow. What if players were blindfolded and they didn't know where the ball was, who to pass it to, or whether they scored a basket? Goodness knows what the game would change into. A shift in the how parts of the system, like how the players play the game, can have dramatic results. Not only does it literally change the game, it changes the personal attributes that make people successful in that game. Systems thinking is also concerned with the why of systems, changing the system's purpose. Let's change the why of basketball and see what happens. If the original purpose is to score as many baskets as possible in order to be the winning team, what happens if we change the purpose from making baskets to, say, making friends? Would the score even be kept? Would there be teams? What would be the point? Maybe people would just sit together and talk. Or just play catch. Change the why, and you have an entirely new thing altogether. Okay, let's return to education and consider the what, how, and why. We can now more readily see that in education, we usually limit our change efforts to a linear approach to change. We all too often focus our efforts on altering what we can readily see, like changing the curricula, adding new initiatives, new programs, new pressures, and even new people, like bringing in yet another new expert. We are always adding a new what. But this change alone usually proves to be pretty superficial. So it actually makes sense that the mindfulness research didn't work. The researchers simply added a program, added a what to all the other whats, but did nothing else to change the students' experience at school or in their personal lives. So of course the students were still stressed. And of course those students who were struggling already struggled even more. They were given yet another what to worry about succeeding at. Real change requires something deeper, something that addresses the how and the why. As the mindfulness researchers themselves in that study ultimately concluded, they said, "The Myriad Project carefully tested the effects of a brief mindfulness intervention for early teens and found it to have no impact on preventing mental health problems or promoting well-being. In order to improve well-being for young people, it is likely we need to make broader systemic changes in schools that both teach them new coping skills and support staff to create environments where youth feel valued and respected." Understanding the what, how, and why also helps make sense of the surprising results of the restorative practices study. A restorative approach is a good thing, and in the study they spent 2 years working with schools on the what, and also to some degree on the why and the how. So how come the restorative schools didn't fare any better than the business as usual schools? Well, when researchers dug a little deeper, they found that the 7 business as usual schools had heard about restorative practices and the importance of strengthening relationships. They hadn't formally adopted any program, any what, but they had informally started to shift their how from punishments to relationships in much the same way that the restorative schools were. The researchers also discovered that in the restorative schools, even though the educators had received restorative training, over the course of the 2-year study, many teachers weren't doing it regularly or properly or drifted back to their old ways. The restorative schools had adopted the what restorative practices, but hadn't changed their culture, their why and their how, sufficiently to support the new practices in a sustainable way. So in the end, it's no surprise that no differences were shown between the restorative schools and the business as usual schools. Both were about the same when it came to their efforts to shift the all-important why and how. And the restorative schools' added focus on the what proved relatively unimpactful, as would be guessed thinking systemically. So, going forward in the school year and wanting to ensure that our efforts at making positive change to support students and educators actually have the maximum benefit, what lessons can we take from systems thinking and the influence of changing the what, the how, and the why? Lesson number 1, clarify your why. It's important that we are clear about our purpose. That might sound obvious, but often our purpose isn't clearly stated. It's communicated through our actions. However, often what we believe, our espoused theory, doesn't always line up with our actions, our theory in use, especially on those really challenging days. So it's important to make explicit your why. And it's not just about knowing the purpose behind a particular initiative. It's about knowing your personal purpose. Why you are an educator, your most important goals for your students, what your school stands for, and the lived values that broadly underlie your school division, and so much more. Lesson number 2, focus your efforts on the how. We can get distracted by looking for yet another what, but it's usually the how that matters the most, though is often the least obvious. And there are a lot of hows to pay attention to, such as how you teach, how you connect with students and staff, how the school day is structured, how the classroom and school are laid out, how technology is used, how you define progress, communicate success, and use information, the pressures within education and how they are managed, and finally, how the organization is structured. These all powerfully influence the way the system works. And finally, be wary of simply adding another what. Our go-to strategy is always to see a problem and look for a solution, and then feel a sense of accomplishment when we've done so. We can tick a box, but think twice before you add new programs, pressures, posters, or practices on top of what you're already doing. These look good on paper, but they may not make much difference unless they are supported with the why and the how. Linear thinking and adding a what is appealing because it's tangible. We can point to the new program we've adopted and feel good. However, systems thinking, focusing on how and why, on the other hand, are subtle and intangible and much harder to measure as easily. But it's the hows and the whys that matter most. For more information on the how, why, and what of education, go to thirdpath.ca.